Hello, everyone. Today is an additional program on Radio VERA channel, and this one is in English. However, as you all know, YouTube has facility to switch to Russian subtitles. So if you speak Russian, you can do this now. Please select from settings Russian subtitles, and now I'm going to repeat the same message for our Russian listeners. Привет всем, это дополнительная передача «Радио Вера». Пожалуйста, для тех из вас, которые плохо понимают на английском языке, переключите субтитры на русский язык, используя систему, которая есть в YouTube. Просто выберите субтитры на русском языке, и вы сможете следить за нашим разговором. Теперь я переключаюсь на английский язык. All right, switching back to English, today our main guest is Michael Strong. Michael Strong is a TED speaker. He is an innovator in education, and he is also an investor to a well-known project, Prospera, which is a free economic zone or special economic zone in Honduras on an island of Roatan, which has reduced regulations that encourage business. About all these topics, his educational experience, his innovative educational platform, and his participation in the Prospera project, we will talk today. As well, my co-host today is Gregory Magarchak. You have heard already Gregory several times on our show. Gregory is a specialist in cryptocurrency. Also, he has started college very early, so he can also contribute something to our conversation about education. As well, he is a piano prodigy, having played piano in Carnegie Hall starting at age 7. So I think this is a very good group, and we will find out a lot about what it means to study and understand things, as well what it means to have freedom, economic freedom. Now I invite into my studio both Michael Strong and Gregory Magarchak. Hello, Michael.
Hello, nice to be here, Boris.
How is life in Austin?
Well, it's we're going to get down to 27 degrees tonight, Fahrenheit, which is cold by Austin standards, but I grew up in Minnesota and Alaska, so I feel like a wimp even talking about that being cold.
Yeah, we are experiencing strange weather these days. In Vancouver, where I live, sometimes we get snow, not every year, but not this year, unfortunately. So we are missing the snow. Greg, how is the weather in sunny Florida, is it, or New York?
Oh, you can see the weather's fantastic over here. I'm in New York. I am it's actually nice in New York, but very cold. Happens to be sunny, though.
Now, Greg, you started college very early, right?
I did. I graduated high school at 13. It wasn't my idea, but my parents thought that my time in high school would be wasted and I should go to college. So I went to Brooklyn College after all that.
So, Michael, can you talk a little bit about your approach to education? And we would like then to get Greg's feedback as someone who also experienced fast path to education. See if your method jives with what Greg experienced.
Oh, happy to. And I'll kind of lean into the, I see education, it should be talent development, personalized talent development. So the standard model, which is state-driven, it goes back to the Prussians in the late 18th century. The Prussians had the state runs education systems. And so almost everywhere in the world at this point, school consists of first grade, second grade, third grade, math, science, social studies. We've got a pretty standardized system around the world. Meanwhile, as an adult, I regard schooling as the bottom 1% of my educational experiences. On my own, I am an autodidact. I learn a lot very quickly. I enjoy learning a lot very quickly. And my campaign as an educator, excuse me, is to shift from the standard model of schooling to talent development for young people. And so we provide a structure for that. But I see education should be very personalized. So I like our school, the Socratic Experience, we focus on creative, entrepreneurial, and intellectual kids. And we lean into where their particular genius is. So to give you a concrete sense, and we can go into the details more later, I've got entrepreneurial students in high school who have zero interest in taking high school chemistry. So we don't force them to take high school chemistry. I got straight A's, total waste of time. And instead, they are learning entrepreneurship. And at the high end, I have a digital marketing kid who's going to make about $200,000 as a 17-year-old. So why should he have sat in chemistry class if he can rock it as an entrepreneur? And so basically, I encourage both in our program and for parents to look at their child's interests and genius and develop it, while, by the way, being mostly stress-free. Because if you're doing what you love and loving what you're doing, you don't have gobs and gobs of coursework that's irrelevant, that's bogging you down. So I'll pause there.
Greg, do you agree with this idea that we should not teach stuff that people don't want to learn?
For the most part, yeah. So
bring up your volume. Bring
sorry. Can you hear me now? Is this better? Yeah.
Yes.
So for the most part, yeah. And Boris, you might not know this, but I have a lot of experience with sort of educational technology.
No, I didn't know this.
My mother was a school teacher for 25 years, I'm going to say.
Okay.
She just recently retired, but she saw the schools change even. There's almost this aspect of government schools being a daycare center for the kids, kind of, as the parents go to work for corporations, right? The kids have to stay in this building and do stuff. So there's also an element of that. And I'm also, should say, really inspired by certain things. Like I remember reading this article in New York Times, Michael, maybe you've seen it, When Math Makes Sense to Everyone. This is John Mighton, I think, that's his name. Anyway, he had this idea of jump math, this program. This was 2011. And the idea was to break everything down to micro things and catch when people are falling behind early. So I really believe in like flipping the classroom. I absolutely believe in that our education system might be reformed. And even like some Montessori schools have been doing a good job. So I'm really looking to see how we can improve it. And one last thing I want to say about that, the Khan Academy and Salman Khan doing those videos. Yeah. So Bill Gates invested in him. It became a big thing. A few years ago, Salman Khan gave this lecture about something called the 2 Sigma problem, Bloom's 2 Sigma problem. And this is where if everyone gets individual attention and, they all do well and the bell curve is like destroyed, everyone's pretty much doing well. Now with AI, that's possible. And that's, I think, what the next frontier could be. So those are my thoughts with regard to what could be coming.
All right. Well, let me ask you another question because you raised the issue of Montessori. Michael, your program is fitting well in Montessori curriculum.
Yeah, no, and just to kind of locate Montessori within the things that Greg is talking about, Montessori has been highly personalized for 100 years. In a Montessori classroom, kids can go at their own rate. Some Montessorians do a better job of that than others, but in principle, in Montessori, a kid can advance through, say, math or reading at their own rate. And I think one-size-fits-all education is really not possible. Kids are so different. And then going back to math, because it's the most sequential thing at all, we can talk about the Socratic piece later. I'm a big fan of math apps, and I do think AI is going to help the math apps. There are a lot of math apps that help personalize mathematics. And we have had students that do 2 years of math a year. I had one student who did 4 years of math a year. And we offer them actually choice between Khan Academy and another product called Math Space. And we're looking at Math Academy, which looks even better. But as you combine the opportunity to go at your own pace in math with AI tutors, with human tutors, because I think there's a layer of humans that will continue to be important for kind of motivation, inspiration, complex thinking, and that sort of thing. But the fact is, going back to the 2 Sigma issue that Greg mentions, we can accelerate most students significantly by personalizing their program, which, by the way, includes going more slowly. There's some kids, the thing with math is if you didn't, say, master decimals and fractions, then you could be lost later on. And so sometimes the great thing about personalization is you can go back and go more slowly and really develop mastery on a layer that you need, and then you can go fast again later on. But I think one size fits all math has been a catastrophe. And then just briefly to address Greg's first comment about the babysitting issue, I'm very interested. I think American culture is a catastrophe, especially American adolescent culture is a catastrophe. And most kids in American high schools are not learning. To give you some data points, 75% of high school students are unhappy. 2/3 are not focused on learning. Teen suicides go up 30% during the school year. And a lot of this is cultural erosion. I think, back 40 years ago, the culture was more robust. And for a variety of reasons, we've seen cultural erosion. Just one other little bit on the collapse of schools. Greg, since your mom was a teacher, back in the day, one of the things that made public education much better in the United States is all the smart women who didn't have other jobs. So up until about the 1970s, smart women went into teaching. And a lot of, even into the 90s and so forth, a lot of the most intelligent public school teachers I knew were women. And then, you get into the 80s and now women can be lawyers and doctors and engineers and whatnot. And now the average public school teacher has fairly low SAT scores, and it's a problem of talent at this point.
I see. Well, Michael, can you tell us a little bit more about the actual enterprising, your schools, how they set up, where they are they virtual, physical?
Yeah. So I have a virtual school, the Socratic Experience, grades 3 through 12. The younger grades are modeled on Montessori, but of course you can't be Montessori virtually. Starting in 6th grade, we have a core program that's 2 hours a day of Socratic dialogue, mostly classic texts. We read some Plato and Shakespeare as early as middle school. Then we have 2 hours of STEM, and that includes some complex problem solving. We do math competition problems and SAT math problems and other logic puzzles, that sort of thing, as well as the standard sequential math program using these math apps. So one of the reasons we do the complex problem solving is the math apps at present are still relatively rote. They give you the same kind of problem in multiple iterations. Whereas in order to really develop problem solving skills, I think you need something beyond what the math apps offer. For people who happen to be familiar with Georg Polya's How to Solve It, that's a model for me for problem solving. Polya is one of the famous Hungarians. Sometimes they talk about the Martians, the Hungarian mathematical geniuses of the 20th century. So very influenced on the problem solving side. In addition to the kind of core math and core STEM, we have electives that are mostly creative and entrepreneurial. We have an art teacher who's a TikTok star. He has 600,000 followers, 27 million likes. He takes the students' drawings and shows them how to draw the elbow more realistic, how to draw a smile, that kind of thing. We've got film editing and film video because a lot of kids want to learn how to do video for YouTube and Instagram and so forth, TikTok. We have a PhD musician teaching a music class, global music appreciation. We have a digital marketing elective, so our kids who want to make money, that's the quickest, fastest path for money making. We have a coding software development class, starts with Python. Then we go into Harvard CS50, Harvard's Introduction to Computer Science. We've had students as young as 8th grade passing the Harvard course and getting a certificate. We have Spanish, 3 levels of Spanish, beginning, middle, advanced. I teach a purpose course. What do you love? What are you good at? What does the world need? What will the world pay for? 5 days a week. We explore different aspects of these questions. And then finally, we can give a student high school credit for any course on Coursera, Udemy, so they can take as many college courses as they want, get high school credit. And then we can also do independent study. So going back to Carnegie Hall, I had a student who got a choir credit because she sang in Carnegie Hall, and then we backed up and so what did you need to do to get there? Yeah, we can give you an independent credit for that. So that's a high-level sketch.
I see. Well, then the natural question from every parent who is maybe was considering the online variant, how kids complement like the studying with actually playing together and knowing other kids.
No, great question. First, as a virtual environment, we're extremely social. So if we're engaged in Socratic dialogue for 2 to 4 hours a day, the kids are thinking, talking, arguing together. Whereas in a standard class, they're staring at the teacher and they just see each other at lunch or whatever. So very engaged environment. We also have both community and clubs where kids get together and hang out. We have baking club and chess club and debate club and Dungeons and Dragons club and all these clubs.
That's online or is physical?
Yeah, virtually. So, there are a few cities where we have enough students to get together in person. We're getting there in New York, San Francisco, LA, Miami, Austin. But mostly it's a virtual community. We do go to Greece. We've gone to Greece twice. We're planning on going to Greece again this year. So mostly it's a really warm virtual community. We have a Slack channel. They're on Slack. Separately, they created their own Discord channel that we don't control. And so they're out doing things on Discord, occasionally inappropriate, but they're on there basically all the time. So virtual, but a very engaged social community virtually.
All right, great. Well, thank you for information. And if people want to find out about the school, where do they go?
www.socraticexperience.com. Socraticexperience.com.
Right. Socraticexperience.com. I'm going to put it in the description of the video and in the chat after we upload this video to the main Radio VERA TV channel after the recording. All right, this is very interesting. So now you're also involved with the free market movement.
Yeah, I'll go way back there. My parents were uneducated. My dad was elevator repairman. My mom was a high school dropout. I didn't know anything about politics and economics. And because in the United States, all smart people are leftists, that used to be the case, or that seemed like it was the case. I'd read the New York Times, Harper's Magazine, New York Review of Books, New Republic, and of course, socialism good, free market capitalism bad. So I ended up going to graduate school at the University of Chicago to study why these people were pro-free market yet pretended to be scientists. With all the hubris of youth, I thought I could go and prove the Chicago economists wrong. I realized I didn't know anything about economics. I came to have a huge amount of respect for Chicago econ initially, and then later Austrian economics. I later discovered, Hayek and the Austrians. Now I would just say I'm much more Austrian. And then later, this is jumping ahead, but it gets into the free market piece. I met John Mackey, founder and CEO of Whole Foods. John and I are both libertarians who came from the left. And, we realized that instead of being against taxes and regulations, we're pro-entrepreneurial solutions. So the spin we took on it, and he and I created a nonprofit called Freedom Lights Our World. The whole spin is, let's create entrepreneurial solutions. And if that means getting rid of taxes and regulations, hey, so much the better. So ultimately, I'm an anarcho-capitalist where I get into creating free market jurisdictions, new city-states, because that's the ultimate entrepreneurial solution. And that gets into Prospera. I will acknowledge, of course, crypto is a free market solution. Bitcoin is going to liberate us from fiat currencies. And in education, I want to underthrow government education by better virtual education with ultimately AI tutors at scale. So yeah, we're all about, my image of government is primarily this thug who takes a baseball bat to our knees and then afterwards comes and puts a Band-Aid on the damage they've caused. And so I want to get people to realize, let's stop having the baseball bat, break our knees and ignore the little Band-Aids they might put on after the fact they've destroyed our lives.
Greg, I'll give you a moment to speak, but I just want to mention that I do not agree with everything that you said. I think that the city-states are not going to work and the government is necessary. But since you're the guest and I'm the host, we will not go too much into it. I will just mention that I'm a follower of Ayn Rand. You can see behind me some books from Ayn Rand. And maybe in another time we will discuss this in depth. But I want to focus with you with the actual steps that the Prospera. I think you're an investor in Prospera, so we can talk about this. But first, let's see what Greg has to say about what you said.
Well, it looks like I know Boris. I've been on the show a couple of times. So we've got an objectivist, follower of Ayn Rand, and we got two libertarians. And there's so many flavors of libertarians, too. I like to say I'm sort of left libertarian. That's sort of, I believe in things like open source software. And I think the less ownership there is also by large corporations, that's good. Like, for example, now, OpenAI and these corporations, I'm a tech bro, I'm a technology person, but the tech sector has become very much friends with our new government, right? And one of the biggest things now is they have this $500 billion Project Stargate that they want to have build all these data centers. It's Sam Altman's wet dream, to have all these things. Happens to be China over there whoever in China did this came out with a model that's like 50 times cheaper, and they're undercutting them. So it's even interesting how they're going to recoup their $500 billion outlay that they're talking about. But of course, it's sort of weird because Elon Musk is in charge of cutting costs, and he doesn't like Sam Altman or whatever, so he's criticizing him. But at the same time, Altman's crowd is trying to get as much as possible. And of course, we had the Biden administration talking about Taiwan and the chips. We have to move it here because we never know what will happen over there with China and Taiwan. So AI is a big factor. Tech is a big factor. But I love community. I love communities getting together and serving their own people, right? I, like Michael, I believe that large states, large corporations, large federations can become out of touch with the people on the ground, right? This whole thing that we have the students online, they form a community, and the parents form a community, and they help each other. I think ultimately that's way better than the cookie cutter government schools and all these other services that they have. So I'm very much on board with that. I say I'm more on the left because I consider the community aspect to be really important. I build software, the money is a community phenomenon, and I'd like to see every city have its own currency as well. I just conclude by saying it's called the Socratic Experience. Actually, I'm reminded of a quote by Socrates that very few people know, but he criticized books, okay? In his time, he was not a fan of books. And he said it's because you couldn't speak to a book, and the book only, is one way. The knowledge only goes one way. Well, now with AI, you can speak to a PDF, right? You can have all these dialogues. So I feel like it's a very interesting time we live in, where AI can almost be a participant in the community, and we see what can happen. So yeah, I'm a libertarian as well. I support Prospera. I've been there a bunch of times, and I'm happy to see people investing in such things.
Thanks, Greg. Well, let's just connect all this together without going into a debate because we don't really have time for this. But speaking of communities, you basically have created a community, Michael, right, with your school experience.
Very much so.
You have connected a lot of families.
Very much so. And I would echo Greg, actually. I'm also, sometimes I say communitarian, sometimes left libertarian. Actually, I like communitarian, libertarian better. And I would say, actually, my whole focus on creating schools and newer jurisdictions is creating new and healthier communities. I've written a lot. I've got a Substack where I talk about, I see new jurisdiction creation and new community creation as two of the most important industries in the 21st century. And of course, tech, but I think the meat space realities of better legal environments and better communities is part of that. And kind of even connecting the education with the jurisdiction. On Prospera, I've got a former student who's working with me as mentee, and she's creating educational communities on Prospera in real life. And I'm also working with some other people to create kind of free-range kids. I grew up in the 70s when I'd leave home in the morning on my bicycle and not come home until midnight or whatever, dark, whatever, but out having fun and playing.
Yeah.
And now in the US, kids' lives are highly controlled. We need safe places where women and children can go out and do what they want to do any time of day. And people can have vibrant local communities in real life, talking, speaking, doing cool things together.
So maybe we should have a kind of like a Disneyland territory where it's controlled by some adults. There are adults there watching about everything that's going on. Yet kids don't really feel that watch, and they are free to roam all day. That would be something that sounds like what you suggest.
Absolutely. And by the way, if we wanted to go in the tech direction, there's tech that measures psychological safety and emotional engagement and other things with either facial recognition or voice or heart rate variability. You can monitor how your kid's doing. And I'm actually looking at this for schools because, again, public schools are suicide factories. They're horrible places where kids' lives are destroyed. And so I want to encourage parents to monitor via tech their child's well-being during the day, so they know when their child is in crisis and not leave them in these hellholes. And so I think as parents realize, hey, my child doesn't need to be unhappy, my child can be flourishing. And so whether it's, monitoring them in these Disneyland free-range kid paradises and or a rationale for pulling out of the existing schools, we can actually have that be tech enabled if the parents and child want it.
Well, let me ask you a bit more about why you say that regular school is a suicide factory. Can you talk about
Yeah,
this?
this is very data driven. You can look it up in Scientific American, entirely mainstream. There is really solid data showing that when kids during the school year, teen suicide rates go up about 30%. They go down again over to Christmas break, down again over summer break. But this particular seasonal pattern stops at high school graduation. So in general, it's a pattern that only exists during the school year. And it's completely unnecessary. I've been doing small personalized schools for 35 years. I've seen hundreds of kids who are anxious, depressed, suicidal at a large public school where they felt anonymous, nobody cared about them, that kind of thing. Go to a small personalized environment, happy, well, off the meds within a few weeks or months. Some of these parents had lots of money to spend on therapists and wilderness treatments and all kinds of things. And a lot of it is, I'm very big on evolutionary psychology. We evolved in, Dunbar scale tribes, 150 or whatever. And all of our human systems were designed for a different kind of experience than the public school experience. It's a radically unnatural experience that was designed for the state for bureaucratic reasons and not for the children.
Now, when you say evolutionary psychology, what do you mean?
So, clearly, we evolved. I think as an objectivist, you're all in favor of evolution. And then, of course, the human mind is part of that which evolved. And so we should be able to look at certain human psychological propensities in light of what was likely over millions of years of evolution. And one of those, I would say, is for, human connection. Obviously, we're in close human contact in evolved tribes. Another one is to have people we look up to and respect in the tribe, and sort of the whole system of virtue. I map on kind of Aristotelian virtue theory onto traditional tribes, where in every tribe there was a sense of honor and excellence and so forth. And so the kind of bureaucratic measure of human beings in schools is radically different from the kind of organic virtue culture that in some variant occurred in all human tribes throughout history. And then we can talk about which virtue cultures, I'm mostly Greek, and so Randian virtue culture is not so far off from where I would be, but still this notion of standards of excellence and an embodied vision of excellence as part of a human community is, I think, human nature, evolutionary psychology, and public schools basically eliminate that from the life experiences of children.
All right, I see. Well, first slight comment is that we refer to Ayn Rand's philosophy as objectivism, so it would be the objectivist view. And the objectivist view is that a person is born tabula rasa. So if you think that we have inherited something from the tribal past, we do, but not biologically. We inherited through, the means of teaching. You're all about school. So our parents teach us something that they were taught. We teach our kids what we were taught. Sometimes we teach them the wrong things, but we still teach them what we have been taught and what we have observed. It's not only through the books, but through the culture. And a lot of information is not even verbal. Sometimes is behavioral, and you learn it and you repeat it. But we do think that people are born tabula rasa, so they know nothing. They have the facility to learn, but it's like a blank computer with a hard drive and empty memory, and it has an operating system, and then you just fill it up with data. All right, Greg, you have disconnected for a moment. I will need to go ahead. Do you want to say something?
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, can you guys? Yeah. No, Michael and I were aligned on so many things. Michael, I think after this, I would love to connect with you.
Love to.
Yeah, there's so much we can talk about. I will just say that there's been two approaches to building these self-sovereign communities. One is the approach taken in Honduras, And I happen to know some people in Liberia. Just happened to meet some politicians. They're looking to do the same sort of ZA thing. And then I know the people. I know Massimo, who did Ciudad Morris.
Yep. Yep.
So he's been very disappointed with the latest Castro president. The Supreme Court decision. And I don't want to get into it too much, but let's just say that Prospera is doing something about it. There's an old law that goes back about American investors, and Patrick Friedman. So what happened is Patrick Friedman, grandson of Milton Friedman, he introduced me to Balaji, and Balaji has the other approach. He has sort of a different approach. He was a former CTO of Coinbase. His approach is called network state. At least he coined it that way. So you know how there's a nation state, so he talks about a network state, which starts online and gradually sort of gets pockets of property here and there and the other thing, right? In my opinion, these kinds of things already exist, like the Soho Club, other things, membership clubs, where you could go visit any country and there's a Soho Club there or something like this. But I like the idea of building online just because there's so much less capital outlay, obviously. And you can repeat it. Like if a program works, you can just like give other communities the software. So starting online and then gradually getting deeper into the physical is definitely something that I can see. Like you don't have to worry about the government's kicking you out in a way. It's a little bit of a backdoor approach. So anyway, it's just an interesting thing. But yeah, I'd love to connect. I'll talk about this. Oh, and Balaji ended up investing in our company a little bit too, because he wants to see this approach take hold.
Terrific. Just may I hop in, Boris? My wife is head of Prospera Africa. She's taken the Prospera model to Africa, and she's happy to connect on Liberia as well. But we're working basically in East Africa, Anglophone countries in East Africa. But her primarily goal is jobs for Africans and prosperity for Africans. And the Honduran government is crazy Marxist. One thing about Latin America is Latin America still has 20th century style crazy Marxism. There's Cuba and Venezuela and now Honduras. For the rest of us, it's like, you guys still believe this stuff? They actually believe this stuff. Whereas Africa has a few Marxist intellectuals, but they're not nearly as influential. Africans basically just want to be prosperous at this point. So, and then there are all sorts of issues on how do you prevent governments from doing what the government of Honduras has done. No guarantee, but I see this two blades of a scissor. Yes, let's do the network state, and yes, let's get jobs for locals. And ideally, I had a friend, Bob Haywood, who is the executive director of the World Economic Processing Zones Association. He said once a zone, in conventional zones now, gets enough jobs going on, then the governments won't touch it. So with traditional zones in Honduras, he designed one that created 100,000 jobs. Once you've got 100,000 jobs, no politician will touch it. And so basically the game is if we can get them up to plenty of jobs, then they're going to be stable. And then one other piece of this is I see capital and talent globally going to the best jurisdictions in the world. And very, very gradually, maybe over 100 years, we'll see all the bad jurisdictions dying and all the capital and talent going to good jurisdictions. And it's already happening. Californians moving to Texas. We can pick our favorite bad city state or bad nation state where capital is flowing out. All bright French coders are leaving to go to Britain or the US, on and on and on.
All right, so let's talk a little bit more in depth about Prospera. Can you, a lot of people who will be listening to us do not know about this. Michael disappeared, and do not know about about this project. And just give a brief overview, and also about what is the current situation. You're muted.
Yeah, sorry. First, I like to make all this very real and not hypothetical. And so I see these zones as just next generation special economic zones. So back in the 1970s, there were only about 30 special economic zones in the entire world. Now there are about 6,000. So there's been exponential growth in conventional zones. Now we have got so many zones, some of them are, I would say, mutating to zones with higher quality law and governance. So the first zones were just, let's reduce taxes, let's reduce regulation. But now we're actually adding a more sophisticated governance layer. So for me, the model of this is the Dubai International Financial Center. In 2004, Dubai wanted to create a world-class financial center. UAE is Sharia law, terrible for finance. Look around the world, all the world's best financial centers run on British common law. Hong Kong, Singapore, London, New York, Chicago, Sydney. And so the rulers of Dubai are smart. They say, okay, we want a great financial center. Let's put a patch of common law on Dubai soil. So 110-acre zone in Dubai has its own legal system, British common law, with a panel of respected commercial law judges to adjudicate disputes. And they've been able to become a top 10 global financial center in 20 years. Citibank, Credit Suisse, Goldman Sachs, all the big financial firms are there. So going from that, then in Honduras, we have a patch of common law, British common law. It's kind of its own thing. It's sort of US, British, its own thing, common law. The idea is civil law is much worse for business, whether it's Spanish, French, Portuguese, whatever. So we put a patch of common law in there with its own adjudication system. Going back to, private adjudication is quicker, faster, and typically more fair. And it has a custom regulatory system. And so, for instance, if you're a healthcare provider in Prospera, you can pick from any OECD healthcare regulation. If the FTA wouldn't allow it, but the EU would, or the Japanese healthcare would, you can do that. So they've really thought through how to get rid of all of the absurd regulatory barriers that prevent business. And they've created one of the top jurisdictions for doing business in the world. There's an e-government system, so you can do everything online. I mean, ultimately, government should be a service. It should be faster, better, quicker service, and Prospera is all in on that. They've got a team that includes the former growth manager of the Dubai International Financial Center. There's Tom Murcott, who led development in New Songdo City, the largest city development in Korea. So they've got a team that can actually do this, and they built it. It's operational. Really exciting. Glad you've been there, Greg. And now the Hondurans, elected this insane Marxist politician who is trying to kill it. There will be, especially with the Trump administration, there will be severe sanctions against the Honduran government if they continue to try to kill it. So basically now we're in a holding pattern where there are new elections in just over a year, and we're hoping with the new elections the Marxists get kicked out, and we've got a sane government once again in Honduras, and then Prospera can take off once again.
All right, but you also mentioned that you need 100,000 people working there. What is the process to get
so
there?
To have stability, you do need to create a lot of jobs. The Prospera does have a mainland site for manufacturing. Right now, the Prospera that Greg and I have visited is on a resort island. It's, more knowledge workers and tourists sort of profile, but they have a site on the mainland where with the new Honduran government, they'll create manufacturing. Manufacturing is a path to large-scale job creation. We can, on Roatan, get there, but it'll take longer. The other thing is there are other means to protect, just to get into the lawsuit. So there are protections for international investors when they invest in countries and the countries confiscate their property. So, oil and mining companies sometimes have their, resources or facilities confiscated. And then there's an international court of settlement, and it's relatively fair. And often there are decisions against the countries for confiscation. Back in the 70s, expropriation was common. All these Marxist countries would expropriate businesses all the time. But gradually, bit by bit, countries have realized if they want to attract foreign direct investment, they have to create a stable investment environment. They have to be in good standing with these international courts. And most countries around the world are now members of the New York Convention on Arbitration, which requires to them to respect these arbitration awards. So there is a system in place. And going back to the consequences for Honduras, Prospera sued Honduras for, I believe, $10 billion for confiscation of their property. And if that was enforced, that would be devastating to the country of Honduras. One way to think about this is no matter how crazy the Marxist officials are there right now, all of the Honduran elites depend on the goodwill of the U.S. on not having these judgments against them. Very concretely, when I was working on this project on the ground, Honduras was the leading importer of U.S. cotton thread. Basically, cotton thread would be created in Texas and Louisiana, taken down to Honduras, made into T-shirts and shipped back. That depends on the Central American Free Trade Agreement. If the U.S. puts up tariff barriers against that, all of the Hondurans elite lose. So basically, we've got them by the balls.
But wouldn't also US lose if the Americans cannot import cheaper products, and they are now struggling where to get the products, say them paying for a piece of bread? I can't remember what example you gave, but let's say it's wheat, and now bread costs $25 a loaf. I mean, it's not in the interest of Americans.
No, and I'm not in favor
more.
of tariff barriers,
Yeah.
but the point is, how do you protect things? There are consequences for not respecting property rights. And ultimately, this is respect for property rights and contract. And again, capital and talent will only flow to those jurisdictions globally that respect property rights and contract rule of law.
Greg, what do you have to say about this?
I think I might be muted. Oh, what do I have to say? I do think that people need to self-organize. I think that technology allows people things that previously was not possible. Things like the Socratic method, right? Also being able to learn better, being able to organize better. Like I said, I think every city should have its own currency. And I think they should interoperate without the current systems. Now, the current systems, look, back when we didn't have technology, it was important. Communism, I think, really took hold at a time when people worked on farms, right? And they wanted to collectivize the farms. In the US, at the same time, we had the combines, the automation. And it was the opposite. People got kicked off of farms. We had the biggest loss of workers, and at the same time, the biggest glut of food, right? People could it was all automated. So there's huge productivity gains, and it takes time for people to figure out what to do next. I think with this AI revolution is going to be much of that across all industries, right? There's going to be a big question of what are people going to do. And by the way, that's a question for education, right? Because if you go to a law school, by the time you graduate, there's an AI lawyer doing everything, or a person that's doing the work of 100. What was the point, right? Now you have this debt. So it is a huge sea change for education. But like, what do I think about countries and investors investing in other? I think two things. First of all, I think the Honduran government, it's just like many other governments, it's their ego, right? What do they care about? What is essentially a private gated community? There's plenty of those in the United States and elsewhere. So they don't really care about that. They just care about it with the optics of what it looks like. Somebody have to have a little bit more autonomy than they should have, right? Because they're like the government of Honduras. So I think that's pretty silly. But at the same time, I think there have been throughout history some serious things where the U.S., like the United Fruit Company in Guatemala, right, and all these other things where you could argue that the United States put pressure on a country to give special privileges to some U.S. corporation. So I don't know. What I can say is I think this one is fairly on the side of there's a bunch of people who are being peaceful and working well with their neighbors. They even Prospera, I think, said that we're not going to expand unless our neighbors allow that. So
they've got a firm commitment against eminent domain. One of their factual piece on, I agree, you're right, Greg, that it's ego, but also the president's brother was caught accepting bribes from narco traffickers in August, and Honduras pulled out of a nearly 100-year-old extradition treaty with the U.S. because they didn't want to ship the president's brother to the U.S. to be sentenced. And at the same time, shortly thereafter, is when they did all this attack on Prospera. And so I think one of the basic strategies of government is, something bad is happening, let's redirect attention to something else. So I think this is partially cover your ass for the president's brother who's a drug trafficker.
That's about right.
Before we Thank you. Before we just go more into the politics of this, I want to know, Michael, what is your participation in the Prospera project? What do you
Yeah,
do? Are you just investing, or you're
so
doing more
I do
about
some
it?
advising, mostly through my wife. I'd say the Prospera Africa initiative is huge, especially if the Honduran government is really, um, putting this negative pressure. Prosperous is eager to have other jurisdictions, because if they expand to 2 or 3 other jurisdictions, then they have great freedom. And even if perchance Honduras happened to kill this one, then all the capital and talent can go elsewhere. In a lot of ways, think about this as as a piece of software. The governance software is instantly portable anywhere, and insofar as they have network state citizens who are relying on this for adjudication, for storing crypto assets, you can imagine a variety of things. Bitcoin is legal tender in Prospera. That as you develop this network of prosperous cities around the world, each node is implicitly protected by the fact there are multiple nodes. So yeah, I'm very much involved in Prospera Africa through my wife. She and I are working on it all the time. And then I also interact with the Prospera team some on broader issues of branding and positioning, and I'm a little bit involved in the education piece, all of that.
I also want to add, by
I
the
want-
way, I realized why I'm so partial to the libertarians building it in Africa and Honduras, right, and everywhere. Because it's small. Because I want to see small experiments grow. Whereas the same type of thing with BlackRock buying up, certain things, or British Petroleum in Iran. I mean, yes, they brought them. They got the oil from the ground, so you got to give them credit for that. But at the same time, you're so big, or the British East India Company with the British Raj coming in. So I think it gets to a point where it's too big, and at that point, I do oppose it on libertarian grounds. But certainly, a small gated community. I mean, it's pretty clear where I would.
What is wrong in being big? What's bad about being big?
It's out of touch with the people on the ground. The British East India Company, or the governors that the British put in place, requisitioned grain. They did it. In fact, the funny thing, the Tea Party, the original Tea Party that led to the U.S. Revolution. The reason why the tea was being shipped around the world, the British had a monopoly on the tea. Okay, speaking of being big, they had just had a famine in India that was essentially, I'm going to butcher this, but a lot of people died. All right, just like in the Bengal famine in the 20th century, they had a famine, and so I think the British wanted to enforce the monopoly of the tea sellers. Anyway, they wanted to boost their tea because they weren't selling it to India. They were getting it from India. They weren't anyways, the colonists weren't very happy with the monopoly.
Well, well, let me clarify something. The monopoly being enforced by the British government, not by a private company.
But that's what always happens. Regulatory capture, where the government is sort of buddy-buddy with whoever, and then they help to bring the muscle in order to enforce. So that's what I'm saying. If they do it on behalf of a large corporation, I'm not so thrilled. But if they do it on behalf of like Prospera, I think like dude, they're not hurting anybody. Like, why? What's the big deal? So.
Well, my contribution here to this conversation is that I'm not against big. I'm against government involvement. In big, small, doesn't matter. Business is separate from running a state. It's just like religion is separate from the state. Business and economics must be separate from the state. So if the East Indian Company wanted to sell tea, but it cannot enforce monopoly, someone else can sell tea also. I mean, what can they do about it? They have to beat it on the price, or on the quality, or on something, right? But there's always a way. There is always an underdog. He can take over if there is no government monopoly. If you remember that you guys are like being around, you remember the old search engines, Lycos and all those, and Alta Vista. Out of nowhere, Google came, and it actually worked better. It actually worked better, so people just started using it. And then that's how they beat all this. And then same thing happened with Windows. No one thought that Windows could be beat, but then came Steve Jobs with a nicer operating system, with a prettier MacBook. If you remember the first MacBooks, people just buying them because they looked cool. They weren't all black and angular, but they were smooth and chrome. And then people preferred doing that and booting Windows, dual booting Windows with Mac. just so that they're like they look nice with this laptop, with this Mac laptop. So there is always a way to beat someone who looks too big. You just have to take some creativity, and it always happens actually. Anyway, not to get distracted, I wanted to ask you about the status of the land of Prospera. Is the land occupied by Prospera owned all of it by a single private entity?
Yeah, so Prospera is designed as a business entity with two components. There's a real estate entity, and then there's a governance entity. And so the real estate entity owns the land. They would be happy to have other landowners become incorporated into their governance system. And if the Honduran government becomes sane after next election, we may see other landowners opt into the Prospera governance system. But separate from the property company, there is also this governance system that you could think of as a tech company. They have both the kind of legal system and the e-government, and that is the piece that can be ported anywhere. So for now, it's this combination, but when we have Prospera Africa, basically the e-government tech company with all the legal system will be ported to Africa, and then we'll presumably have other legal entities owning the land on African sites, again, without ever appropriating any land or even taking it from government. Prospera is only looking at buying land at market value.
All right, so the company that owns the real estate, it's voluntarily allowing this other company to set rules of behavior?
Yeah, and Prospera will actually allow for competitors. There are a bunch of actually interesting things with Prospera to prevent monopoly power of government even. So Prospera would allow citizens within the entity to set up a different governance system. The other thing is you can sue Prospera if you're a citizen within Prospera. One of the, I think, worst ways that governments abuse citizens in the United States and most of the world is sovereign immunity. When we were seeing all these things of, people being beat up by the police, it's very difficult, even a policeman basically murders you, to sue the government. Whereas in Prospera, if you think that Prospera is violating your rights, you can sue them, and it's called baseball arbitration. You pick an arbitrator, they pick an arbitrator, and a third arbitrator makes the decision. And so the idea is, even vis-a-vis government, your rights are protected, which is really unusual.
I think you can sue the American government. You can sue it now as an American.
It's very difficult. Very difficult.
Also, there's sovereign immunity. I mean, they just dropped all the charges against Trump as soon as he got elected, right? I'm not even saying I think it was silly charges. A lot of it was silly, right, and lawfare. But the argument was he's the president now, so obviously, we're not going to pursue anything. And it goes all the way down. The police officers get fired and sometimes get a severance pay, right? But it's the department, it's the taxpayers that pay that. It's not the police officer. He's not paying anything. He or she.
Yeah, they're not personally liable, and nor is there an entity that's directly liable. So it is much more difficult to sue government.
I see. Well, not all charges against Trump were false. I think he is guilty of the January 6th uprising, and he should be in jail. But because he's a president does have some immunity, and there is a reason to remove charges from what the president does.
You have the characteristic bluntness of an Ayn Rand, I would say. I enjoy that. Wow. Can I ask you a question, by the way?
Thank you. I appreciate
I have a question for you.
I appreciate
you said a monopoly, you don't like when people use government for monopolies, right? But the one exception, and I always wondered about this is patents, right? It's intellectual property. Because Ayn Rand strongly supported going to the government. Yeah. And she even said, where the competition is who can get to the patent office faster. I don't know if she said that tongue in cheek.
Well, if I move my head slightly to the left, you will see that I have a patent right on my bookshelf, of which I'm quite proud, which I have put it on display. The patents are not forever. The purpose of the patents is to give the person who invented something the first right to market. But you cannot patent nature. Someone else could come up with the same idea independently. And there's no way for you to know that it's not happened, right? You could invent the light bulb. Two people can invent light bulb. Maybe they work slightly differently, or radio. And actually, many times in history, it does happen that two independent people do invent the same thing and you can then ask who was first, right? So to avoid all this, that you make the patent only limited in time. How long should it be limited in time? That's then is for judges to decide, to set some precedents. Now I got it for 17 years. Maybe it's too long, kind of feels too long, but the point is that it does. If someone comes, the reason that we want to protect the right of someone to coming with intellectual property, something that libertarians do not agree. They think intellectual property should not be patented. The reason is that everything that you do comes from what you think, right? Even if you raise your hand and you work with a hammer and you create physical property, you're directing your activity from your mind. Your mind is really doing the real work, right? If you're using an excavator, you're pushing a button, right? You had to earn money to buy the excavator. Usually, maybe you're a developer, a coder. You earn the money with your mind. Everything ends up physical. That libertarians agree that should be like protected, but intellectual, no. Intellectual is more important than physical because it's closer to the mind.
Well, just to
it's
clarify,
just that
basically, because I keep going to the issue of scale, right? Small versus big. When you work with your hammer and you make one thing, that's one thing, right? You don't own every other thing that someone made. My point is, when you have an idea, Thomas Jefferson said, it's like somebody lights their taper at mine. It means the fire, right? He gets fire from me, and my fire is not diminished. But my point is, if you have an idea, a lot of times the idea gives rise to a lot of manufacturing all over the world. And so your effect on the world through this partnership with government is much larger, right? Drugs, whatever. You can restrict who gets the drugs or who pays for the drugs. Whereas if you work with your hands, there's only so much that you can really produce as an individual, right?
Okay, but I don't quite follow. But if you run a factory, that's a physical product. You can create billions of these toothbrushes, right? That considered private property.
Well, I don't restrict anyone else from
You only how to design once, and you produced millions of it or billions of it.
Right, no, I agree. I'm just saying I'm not restricting others from making a factory which produces the exact same thing.
Okay, I see what you mean, but I don't think we have time to go into it in detail. We only have a few minutes left. I usually try to keep these sessions for an hour. Let's first of all see if Michael has some feedback about what we discussed, and then we will go back to what's Michael specifically about, the education and Prospera.
Yeah, well, the intellectual property is very complex. Won't go into it. I'm kind of agnostic, open to a variety of arguments in that. Kind of going back to education and Prospera, I want to give people a sense that entrepreneurial solutions can change everything. I consider what I do as underthrowing governments, not overthrowing government, but underthrowing. And the analogy I use is, at this point, the U.S. Post Office basically subsidizes junk mail. All it does is, at massive expense, it puts junk mail in our mailboxes with the taxpayers paying for it. I see that the direction that public schools are going to take, and eventually most government functions. I think the private sector is faster, better, cheaper. And as we have the private sector taking on more education, more adjudication, more currency issues, I think of government as sort of like the Queen of England, still exists, big, expensive, does nothing. And I imagine in 100 years, we'll still have governments, big, expensive, does nothing. And almost all the action will be in the private sector currency, education, adjudication, and infinite tech improvements all over the place.
I completely agree.
I see. All right. We will table this disagreement about government running education a bit later. Not education. Education, yes. Education have to be private. But let me ask you, do you plan to have a school in Prospera running by your system?
So there is currently a Montessori school there, and I'm helping there a little bit, and we might actually play a much larger role next year. So that's we're in process on that. I mentioned I have a former student who's there on the ground, and she is working there as well as with a small local school for local kids as well. So we've got a little outpost there and looking to grow it.
For many parents like me, young parents with kids, it's very important child education. And I personally would be ready to move. If for a good school, I would move. This is a situation for many parents. And first of all, teaching kids is expensive. It's expensive paying for the private schools. If you have more than one, you have to pay double, triple. And then what do you get? You want to make sure that even if you pay all this money, you actually get something for it. And many people are frustrated. They end up doing teaching kids at home, and then they're distracted. They cannot do their work. Or if they send it to school, many schools, for example, in Canada, they teach stuff I don't want my child to learn, but I don't have a choice. My child doesn't know anything about the Greek history, but he knows how the Aboriginals made a hut. He knows that, and all the kind of different huts. I think this information is not primary. He can learn it when he is older, if he is interested in this topic. But unfortunately, the Canadian education system forces these things on the children, and I'm sure things are equally bad in other countries. So I am very happy to learn that, Michael, you have this educational interest and streak, and you're running a business. You have attracted a lot of kids. Especially objectivists consider education the biggest problem, more than politics, but because it all starts with education. And in your TED talk, you said that you want to teach kids or even adults to actually read and understand exactly what is it that they're reading, so they can form their opinion from their first-hand experience, not by hearsay, but from first-hand experience.
Absolutely, and actually, just to connect this to rationality, I see the core Socratic experience is we have a mutual expectation of consistent, coherent interpretations of reality. So if you contradict yourself, you have an obligation to reconcile that contradiction. If I contradict myself, I have an obligation. It's rational discourse 101. I love Whitehead's notion that all of Western philosophy may be seen as a series of footnotes to Plato. I think that's exactly right. Once you get into consistent, coherent expectations, then we have rationality and we can make the world a better place.
Yeah, I agree that it's Plato, Aristotle, and Kant, and Ayn Rand. That's the four big names in philosophy. And we can maybe finish our interview at this. I encourage people again to check the SocraticExperience.com website. If you have kids, you can enroll your kids, especially if you don't even live in a Western country and you want your child to receive a Western education. This is your way to do this. Education is one of the best in class, from what I gather, from what I understand about Michael. And you can actually hear his TEDx talk that he gave. Is very interesting and entertaining to watch, very educational. And I encourage you to enroll your kids to his school. Also, thank you, Greg, for joining our session. We will have more of these sessions on Radio VERA, I'm sure, and also in private. And I wish success to initiatives that encourage business, that allow business to prosper. And in this case, Prospera is moving in the right direction.